Well, I'm just going to be honest with you up front. This is the hardest sermon I preach all year long, is Mother's Day. Now, if I say something specifically on Father's Day, I'm a guy. I know how guys think. But I'm sure you've heard the joke about the man who's walking along the beach in California, and he kicks this little bottle in the sand, and he opens it up, and a genie pops out, and he says, "I'll give you one wish, whatever you want." And he says, "Wow." He says, "I've always wanted to go to Hawaii, but I'm afraid to fly, and I don't like big boats and to be in the water that long. Can you build me a bridge from California to Hawaii?" And the genie, "Oh, that's way too much. I couldn't do something like that." So then he says, "You're going to have to come up with another wish." And he says, "Well, can you help me to understand my wife?" And the genie says, "Do you want that bridge to be 2 lanes or 4? I've had a mother for 69 years, a sister for 63 years, and I've been married for 41 years. And I still don't know how they tick. I don't know what, but it's the glory and the beauty and the magnificence of the women in our lives that make life worth living. So please bear with me as I do my best here. And as I was praying, Lord, what can I say? I just felt like to just mention some of the women in the Bible and their lives and what a part they played on the planet Earth, the history of this planet. And of course, you can't start out anywhere other than the mother of all of us, which is Eve. And you know the story. God said, "Let there be light," and the entire physical universe came into existence. Now, astronomers and science tells us that the physical universe is approximately 150 million light years wide. But the book of Isaiah says God measures the width of the universe with a span of his hand, from here to here. He says, yeah, the universe is about that big. So we're talking about a big God. But in the midst of this colossal, magnificent creation called the universe, there's this tiny little blue marble floating in space. And, from the sun, the planet Earth is just barely even visible. Now, we think we're pretty hot stuff living down here on Earth, but in comparison, we're microscopic. But God chose that one planet, and it was covered in water when he first made it. And I'm not going to go into the whole creation story, but he drew back the water and revealed some land, and he made birds fly in the sky, fish in the sea, things crawl on the earth, things grow on the earth. And he spoke everything into existence, because the power of his word, there's nothing in existence more powerful than his word. Jesus said, "Heaven and earth will pass away. My words will never pass away." But the first thing God touched in recorded history is he got some mud from the earth and he scooped it together with his own hands. Talk about the ultimate sculptor. Now, the word Adam in the Hebrew means red. So God took some red clay and he sculpted this human being, this man. And I mean, we're talking about an incredible sculpture from the inside out, with blood vessels and cells and amoebas and alveoli in the lungs and the circulatory system, the respiratory system. And then he put skin and he put hair and muscles and just all these things that he did. And then he breathed into this man and made him a living soul. I dare any other sculptor to do that, to breathe into their work and make it a living soul. But we're talking about God here. And then one day God said, "It's not good that the man should be alone." So you know the story. Put Adam into a sleep. And he didn't take a bone from the top of his head so that woman would be above him. And he didn't take a bone from his feet so that woman would be beneath him. But he took a bone from his rib so women would be equal, his helpmeet, co-equal. And then when Adam woke up, now God took the original prototype and he made it so much better. But this man became a womb man, a man with a womb, so that from this woman's womb, all the people of the earth would come. And Adam went, "Whoa, man, what a beautiful creature. Nothing he's ever seen like that." But he said, your name is going to be called Eve. And in the Hebrew, Eve is the word kava, and it means life giver. From you, Adam knew this. Now, Adam, they say even Albert Einstein only used 10% of his brain. Adam used 100% of his brain. So did Eve. They were brilliant beyond description. But Adam knew. He said, out of you is going to come all the human beings that are going to live, because God said, be fruitful and multiply. And he said, okay, if you insist, I will. But then one day, Eve was walking through the garden, and typical of women, I'm sorry guys, but we're guilty of this. So many times women get a bad rap. They get blamed for the things that us men failed in our responsibilities. But she's just walking along, and all of a sudden there's this one tree that God said don't eat of. Now, God never told Eve don't eat of this tree. He told Adam. Now, how much emphasis Adam put on the part of don't eat of that tree or we're going to die. First of all, they don't know what die means. And second of all, did he say, oh yeah, don't eat of that stuff? Or did he say, don't eat of that or we're going to die? We don't know how much emphasis he paid on that tree. But Eve saw this creature over there talking, a talking serpent of some type. And you know the story, she ate of the fruit. And we always say, yeah, all this bad stuff in the world came because of that woman. Well, if you read the story closely, after she ate of that fruit, she turned and offered it to her husband. Adam was standing right there, close enough to hear this conversation. He could have said, knocked that fruit out of her hand, says, don't eat of that. He could have told that serpent, shut up and get out of here, because he had authority over the earth. But he stood there and he allowed it to happen, and he ate of that fruit. Now the Bible tells us sin entered into the world by one man, not by one woman. God blames the man for that. And here Eve gets this bad rap. And then after the fall, her first son, she said, behold, the Lord has given me a man. And the first human being born through the normal gestation period is a man named Cain. And the second man born from the normal gestation period was a man named Abel. And Eve had to go through the experience of her oldest son killing her youngest son. Now, ladies, those of you that are mothers, that's going to leave marks. And this lady, Eve, gets a bad rap for all this. Did she have her part to play? Yeah. But Eve was the second-hand information to don't eat of that tree. And if anybody speaks bad of Eve, you're talking about my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma. That's my grandma. And we all came from her. And when you think about that, you can see the deception and the lies of the devil, who does nothing but try to steal, kill, and destroy, to make all us human beings on earth say, oh, because of the color of your skin, or because of how tall you are or short you are, or what part of the world you were born in. One segment of society is better than the others. We all have Adam and Eve's DNA in us. I mean, I look around the room here. There's different people, different colors of pigmentation. Does that mean one's better than the other? If you peel our skin off, we're all pink underneath. So can I only hang around with white guys that are bald? I'd have a pretty boring life, wouldn't I? We all came from Adam and Eve. And this whole racist, prejudice thing is nothing but a lie of the devil. United we stand, divided we fall. And if the devil can get black to hate white, and rich to hate poor, and Jew to hate Gentile, and just divide us, the more he can divide us. We all came from our mom, our great times 1,000 grandmother Eve, who is the life giver. According to Adam, he named everything on earth, even his wife. Now, the next woman I want to talk about is a woman named Sarah. She lived in a land called Ur of the Chaldeans. And she was born there. Her whole family's there. Her mom probably lived down the street, and her brothers and sisters lived in the neighborhood. And one day her husband comes home, and his name is Abram. Her name was Sarai at the time. And he says, "Hey, yo, we're moving." She goes, "We are? I don't want to move. This is my home." And one thing I have learned about ladies, they like to decorate their houses and make it home and comfy. When me and Bobette got married, I lived in a 2-story, 3-bedroom house. The only thing in it was my guitar and a mattress. But when we got married, women like curtains on the windows. And they like to hang pictures on the wall. I learned that right away. Well, Sarai's got her house just the way she wants. And Abram comes and says, "We're moving." She goes, "Oh, yeah? Well, where are we moving to?" And he goes, "I don't know." Try that sometimes, guys. Go home and tell your wife, "Hey, we're moving today. Where are we moving?" "I don't know." See how well that works. But Sarai said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Now, we call Abraham the father of our faith because he followed God. But guess who went with him? Sarai. She doesn't get a lot of credit. But instead, Sarah gets the bad rap because when the angel of the Lord came to Abraham and said, "When I come back next year at this time, your wife's going to have a baby." And it says Sarah laughed. So we say, "Oh, that's Sarah. She doesn't have any faith," but Abraham does. Well, look at the whole big picture of the story here. He's talking about a 90-year-old woman who hasn't had a baby yet. Now, when was the last time you heard about a 90-year-old woman having a baby? If you go to a 90-year-old woman and say, "Next year at this time, you're going to have a baby," I'll bet you she laughs if she doesn't punch you in the nose first. But you know what? Sarah did have a baby a year later. But in the midst of that time, in between that time, Sarah, now technically her and Abram were brother and sister. I don't have time to go into the whole gene pool and heredity, but people did that back in those days because the gene pool was so fresh and clean that there was not a lot of tainted stuff going on in our DNA. They had the same dad but different moms. But big old bad tough Abraham, the father of our faith, is going through one village to the next, and he says to Sarah, he says, "Tell everybody when we get there that you're my sister and not my wife because you're so beautiful, I'm afraid they're going to kill me." Now, at 90 years old, she's so beautiful they're going to kill him. That she must have been one good-looking 90-year-old lady. But where's the faith of Father Abraham? That'd be like if I'm driving from Michigan to go to Florida and I get into Ohio and the state trooper pulls me over and I tell Bobette, "You're a beautiful lady and I don't want this cop to kill me, so he marries you, and then I, go to jail or I get killed. So we'll tell him that you're my sister." How do you think that's going to make her feel? But Sarah went along with the program. Not once, but twice that happened. And because of Abraham's inability to stand up and fight for his wife, what happened is she did get taken to Pharaoh's palace. And before Pharaoh could sleep with her, God says, "Don't you dare touch that married woman." So Pharaoh gets Abraham on his cell phone and says, "Hey, Abe, what are you trying to do? You're going to get me killed with your God here. Why didn't you tell me she's your wife?" "Well, I didn't want you to hurt me." And he says, "Well, get her out of here." But when she leaves, she takes with her the servant girl that was given to her, a girl by the name of Hagar. So you know the story. A little bit later, Sarah says to Abraham, "I'm 90 and a half. I still haven't had a baby. So maybe this angel that said that he's thinking about you're going to have a baby with somebody else. So you go into Hagar's tent and lay with her for the night." And Abraham says, "Yeah, okay, if you insist." So think about Hagar. She's a servant girl. How many girls, when they're growing up, saying, "Oh boy, I hope when I grow up I get to be a servant to the rich and famous"? Nobody wants to be a servant girl. But that's what was forced upon her. And she had to leave her family and her friends in Egypt to go follow a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man and live in tents out in the desert. Boy, that sounds like a good deal. But she goes out there, and she's obedient. And when this 100-year-old man comes into her tent to lay down with her, she submits. And to comfort her in all her sorrow, God gives her a beautiful boy by the name of Ishmael. And she loved him. But Sarai then has Isaac. And Isaac, as he grows, Ishmael and Isaac are bumping heads. And Sarah says to Abraham, you better get that woman and her baby out of here. And he says, well, you're the one that told me to go sleep with her. Get her out of here. So Hagar, this poor, innocent servant girl, gets bounced around. Now, Abraham gives her enough food to last a few days. And he says, go out in the desert. Go on. So here she is. What did she ever do to anybody? But she goes out in the desert, and the food runs out, and there's no water, and she can't bear to see the one that she loves more than anything in the world, her little son. She can't bear to see him die, so she leaves him and goes off a distance so she doesn't even have to look at him. And while she's out there, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob speaks to her and says, don't worry, I'm going to take care of you and your son, and I'm going to make of him a mighty nation. And she calls him. She has a relationship with our God. This Phoenician or this Egyptian servant girl, and she calls him the God who sees. And did God keep his promise? Did you ever hear of Saudi Arabia, Persia, Iraq, Iran? All these Muslim nations came from Ishmael. And just as Isaac is the child of promise and Ishmael is the son of the flesh, because Abraham couldn't wait, what's happening in the world today? 99% of the battles that have gone on in this world are because the people of Ishmael are fighting the people of Isaac. And it's still going on today, and it's going to go up to the last battle, which is called the Battle of Armageddon. Now, to jump ahead a little bit, when the children of Israel were living in Egypt and they had become slaves, the decree went out by Pharaoh, kill all the newborn male children, because there's too many Jews in here. We got to get rid of them. Well, there's this one woman by the name of Jochebed, and she just gave birth to her third child, and he's a beautiful little boy. She doesn't want him to be killed, so she makes this little ark out of bulrushes and covers it with pitch and puts it in the Nile and pushes it down the Nile and prays to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, please take care of my son. And her daughter Miriam follows this ark to see where it goes, and it ends up in the house of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's sister finds this ark and says, the gods have given me a child. No, you got that wrong. The God has given you a child. But she raises it, but she said, I need a mother to nurse this child. So she puts out the word, I need a Jewish mother to come. And God arranged it so that Jochebed could nurse her child Moses that she loved so much, just so that she could have that closeness and that joy, but also that confidence that your faithfulness, God has protected your son. He's not dead, and he's going to be raised in a very nice house. And then, as we know how the story goes on, but Jochebed watched her son grow. And one day he finds out that he is Jewish, and he comes back to see her, and she goes, yes, indeed you are. And I'm making a long story short, he kills an Egyptian, and he flees Egypt, and he goes in the land of Midian. And he says, that's it, I'm done with all that, I'm just going to go raise sheep and be left alone. Until one day this bush starts talking to him and says, go back to Egypt. Well, at that time, he married a woman by the name of Zipporah, a Midianite shepherd woman. And he was used to the beautiful women of Egypt that are all painted and the best beautiful silken clothes and perfumed and lotioned. But he found a beauty in Zipporah. Her skin brown from the sun and her skin cracked and leathered. But the beauty that he saw inside was so much more beautiful than any woman he'd ever seen on the outside. And he married her. And together they had a son. And as he goes back to Egypt, Zipporah has to leave all her family in the land of Midian to go follow this crazy preacher who's going to stand against the most powerful man in the civilized world and say, let all these slaves go. She didn't know what's going to happen. Is he going to get killed? Am I going to get killed? Is my son going to get killed? But she followed. And on the way there, God gets Moses and traps him and holds him down to the ground and says, you can't go another step until you have your son circumcised. So Zipporah has to circumcise her son. And she takes that foreskin and throws it at Moses' feet and says, what a bloody God you serve. And she's right. We do serve a bloody God, because without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sins. Amen. And we know what's going to happen to Jesus someday. The life is in the blood. But Zipporah did this and followed him and was faithful all through all the plagues and coming back from Egypt to get to the promised land. And from there, when he left the promised land, or gets into the promised land, he dies and he turns over his mantle of authority to a man named Joshua. And Joshua fights many battles. Did you ever hear Joshua fought the battle of Jericho? Well, how did he win that battle? Obviously with the strength of God. But when they were sending spies in there to check it out, the Jericho army was going to come and arrest these spies and kill them. But a woman named Rahab, a harlot, she risks her life to bring in these two Israeli spies and hide them in this one tower part of the city that she lived in, and hid them in bales of hay up on the roof. And she lowers down a rope from the roof so that they could escape. And they say to her, lower this scarlet cord so that when we come back, we'll know not to hurt you. Now, this scarlet cord represents the bloodline. And did you know, if you read the book of Matthew, Rahab is part of the lineage of Jesus? Now, again, no little girl grows up saying, oh, someday I want to be a harlot. This happened because of a whole series of events that put her in this position that she never wanted to be in. But here, where she's an outcast of society because she helped these Israeli spies, her offspring is giving birth to the Messiah who's going to save the world. And you know, archaeologists I watched this video, archaeologists, when they're going through the rubble of Jericho, you know, the walls of Jericho didn't explode out. They imploded. Because the children of Israel are around the walls of Jericho, if they exploded, they would have all been crushed. But they imploded, killing most of those people before the Israeli army went in to wipe out the rest of them. But do you know, to this day, which is approximately 3,500 years later from this event, the only thing left standing in this pile of rubble of Jericho is this one tower that many believe that's the tower that Rahab, as a testimony of this woman who the people of Jericho said, you're an outcast, you're nobody important here, you're someone to be taken advantage of. But that's not the way God saw her. She's in the lineage of Jesus. And this tower stands as a testimony to her faithfulness. After Joshua died, in the book of Judges, the people of Israel, it says, would do what was right in their own eyes. And the trouble with that is, that's how the world's living today. Everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. The trouble is, we can justify almost anything. I know before I was a Christian, I could get away with anything, and I justified it in my mind that it was okay. And that's what was happening in the land of Israel in those days. So then God would raise up an army to come against Israel, and then they'd all cry, oh, please help us, please help us. And he would raise up a judge that would rally all the people, fight their enemies, and then they would go back and say, oh, please forgive us. We want to serve you again, God. But one of the people, one of the most we think of in the book of Judges, Samuel and Gideon. Gideon was a coward, but Samson, powerful Samson. But you know who one of the most powerful judges was? A woman named Deborah. In Judges chapter 5 and verse 7, it says, "The inhabitants of the villages ceased. They ceased in Israel until that I, Deborah, arose, and that I arose, the mother of Israel." This woman, a woman, one of the most powerful judges in the book of Judges, rallied the people of Israel to fight against their foes. And then came in the book of 1 Samuel, came a woman named Hannah who wanted to have a child. Now back in those days, for a woman to not be able to bear children was not scandalous, but it was very depressing and very looked down upon, for lack of a better term. Even today, you put two guys in a room together that don't know each other, and it's just going to be a matter of minutes before they're going to look at each other and say, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" That's how we judge each other. And if you say, "Well, I'm a garbage collector," then I'm going to say, "Oh, you're just down here. I know how much garbage collectors make." But if you say, "Oh, I'm a brain surgeon," "Oh, I put you up here on a pedestal," because brain surgeons make a lot of money. And we judge each other by how much money we make, how big and strong we are, how young and virile we are, how compared to how old we might be. But you put two women in a room that don't know each other, and it's just a matter of moments before they're going to look at each other and say, "So do you have any kids?" Because that's how we judge each other's importance. "Yeah, I got 10 kids. And you go, "Wow, 10 kids? How in the world did you do that? One kid almost killed me." But if you say, "No, I don't have any children," then we say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for you." Well, in Hannah's day, she had no children. And she was married a long time. And she prayed, and she prayed. And you know what happened? In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 27, it said, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of him." And she gave him a man child. And in those days, the first man child was supposed to be dedicated to the Lord. And God gave her the prophet Samuel and gave him over to the priest Eli. And he raised him. And you know, Samuel is one of the very few people in the entire Bible that there's nothing negative said about him. He served God faithfully every day of his life from the time he was born. Now, yes, he's a sinner just like all of us. But this man became a mighty prophet, the prophet Samuel, all because this one woman faithfully waited and trusted and prayed, and God answered her prayers. Sometimes the best things that happen in our life are the things we have to wait the longest for. And then I want to talk about a woman named Bathsheba. Now, we always hear about David, King David, a man after God's own heart, and he was. But there is a woman named Bathsheba. And David was married to Saul's daughter named Michal. So when you saw them walking down the street, say, "Look, there's David Michal." I just thought I'd say that because I'm David Michal. That doesn't mean anything. But they didn't get along so good. So David one day goes up on the rooftop on a hot summer night, and he looks out and he sees this beautiful woman bathing. Now, he's the king of Israel. He can have whatever he wants. So he calls for her to come to the palace. And you know the story. He sleeps with her, and she becomes with child. But what about Bathsheba? She's just minding her own business. It's not her fault the way that God made her attractive. She's just minding her own business, and this king calls for her, and she has to go. If she doesn't, he could cut her head off, and that did happen in those days. But she's home, bathing on a hot summer night, not exposing herself, not trying to be, a show in any way, while she's waiting for her husband, Uriah, who's a general in the Israeli army, out battling. She's probably praying about her husband. "Oh, Lord, please protect him." And the king summons her. Well, then, David says, uh-oh, I'm in big trouble. So I got it all figured out. I'll call Uriah home and say, now go sleep with your wife. And then he'll think later that child was his, and nobody will know except me and Bathsheba. But Uriah says, no, Lord, I'm faithful to you. I would never leave my men. So David, the man after God's own heart, tells the other generals when he's in battle, step back and leave him. And he gets killed. He's murdered. Well, all this is going on, and we always hear from the Psalms what David was going through. But what about Bathsheba? She's minding her own business. She gets summoned by the king. Now, I don't know if she was raped, but still technically she was, because it wasn't her idea. But if she doesn't, she could have her head cut off, because back in those days they did that. And then if Uriah would have came back and slept with her, she would have kept that quiet for the rest of her life for something she didn't even do wrong. And then her husband dies. So then David, everyone says, oh, what a great man David is. One of his generals dies, and he's going to take his wife Bathsheba into his house and marry her. Oh, what a great man he is. But the only two people that know the real story is David and Bathsheba. Now the prophet Nathan came and pointed his finger at him and said, behold, you're the man. God knew what was going on. But just think what Bathsheba's going through, and then the child that came from that illicit relationship died. So here's innocent Bathsheba, who not only loses her husband and technically gets raped by her king, who everyone says, oh, what a man after God's own heart. But then she loses her husband, and now she loses her child. But God blessed her, because he knew none of this was her fault, with a man named Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, the richest man who ever lived. And Solomon, in his old age, when he became king, he lavished his mother with everything she could ever want. And he showed his love towards her and took care of her to the day she died. And then the last person I'm going to talk about in the Old Testament is a woman named Esther. And again, she was a very beautiful woman in all of Israel and of all Persia, that the king, he summoned his wife Vishtu, and she said, no, I'm not going to see the king. Well, back in those days, you don't do that. So off with her head. She's out of there. So he's got to pick a new wife. And he had all these people go out and, interview all these women. And he picked Esther because of her beauty. And she becomes his next queen. But again, trying to make a long story short, they're going to, because of an edict that the king got tricked into, they were going to kill all the Jews, including her. So she had the courage to go and make a summon to go see the king, which you're not supposed to do in those days. The king calls for you. You don't call for the king. But he loved her so much because, yes, she was beautiful on the outside, but she was even more beautiful on the inside. And her strength and her courage, she was risking her life to stand before the king and say, I want an audience with you to save her people, Israel. Solomon, he said, a beautiful woman without discretion is like a gold ring in a pig's nose. And I've known some very beautiful women in my life, but once you get to know them, they're not so beautiful. And I've known some women that you would say, oh, it's just a plain Jane, but the more you get to know them, they're beautiful. Well, Esther was beautiful on the outside as well as on the inside, and the king said, I'm going to grant your wish. And Haman, who's the one that put together this plot, he was the one that was hung, and all of Israel was saved. All right, jump ahead a little bit to the New Testament. And probably the greatest mother of all was a woman named Mary. And most theologians believe she was about 15 years old when she's just living in a little town of Nazareth, minding her own business. It's late at night, she's trying to go to sleep, and the archangel Gabriel shows up in her room and says, you are blessed among all women. And he tells her the plans that God has for her. Now, she's engaged to a man named Joseph. And she could say, well, let me think about this. Well, first of all, she said, how can this happen? I've never been with a man. And Gabriel says, the Holy Ghost is going to overshadow you, and you will be with child. And she's probably thinking, now let me see, how am I going to explain this to mom and dad? Yeah, I've never been with a man, but just God in his spirit gave me a child? Yeah, how much are we going to believe that? But then I got to go tell my husband that I'm engaged to. Really, I've never really slept with anybody. But in spite of all the things that could have happened to her, she bows down before Gabriel and said, behold the handmaiden of the Lord. And aren't you glad she did? Because if she didn't, inside her womb, the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. But then Gabriel says, the way you're going to know that this is really from God and this is going to happen is I want you to go see your cousin Elizabeth because she's with child. You know, there's an old saying, don't doubt in the darkness what God has spoken in the light. And did you ever have an experience where you're reading scripture, you're praying, or you're looking at a beautiful sunset or whatever, and you feel like God's speaking to you? And then like you wake up the next day and you say, I ate a bad taco last night. I'm just dreaming that up. That never really happened. Well, sometimes we need physical confirmation of what God's doing in our life spiritually. And he knew Mary was going to need this. So he said, you go see your cousin Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is a type and a shadow of Hannah, who was married for a long time, waiting for a child. But when that child finally came, it was Samuel, who no one ever had anything negative to say about, and he was a mighty man of God all the days of his life. Well, Elizabeth was married to her husband, who was a priest. They were married for a long time, and they're waiting for a child and never had one. But then she gives birth to, guess who? John the Baptist. And Jesus says of her son, there's no men born among women. Guys, any of you here were not born among women? Any aliens here from another planet? I don't think so. We all came from a woman. So what Jesus is saying, out of every single human being born on the planet of Earth, nobody is better than John the Baptist. That's a pretty good recommendation from the Son of God. But then he goes on to say, but he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than him. And you know who that is? I'm looking at you. You're born of the kingdom of God. You've called by Jesus and you accepted that calling. You are greater than John the Baptist. But this woman, Elizabeth, as soon as the Virgin Mary came in, John the Baptist jumped up and down. He's probably doing Holy Ghost jumping jacks because the Messiah is coming in. And she said, blessed are you among women. From the moment I heard your voice, the child in my womb leapt with joy. And it says, John was filled with the Holy Ghost in his mother's womb. Talk about a Holy Ghost experience. And here's this woman faithful to her husband, waiting and waiting and waiting for a child. And again, some of the best things that happen in our life are the things we have to wait the longest for. And then there's a woman named Mary Magdalene. Now, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of things we don't know about her. Some people say she was a harlot, which the word never tells us that. But we do know she was possessed by 7 devils. And usually, I've been around demon-possessed people. I was partially there myself once. I wasn't possessed, but I was deep enough into the occult that I could tell you some stories that even make my hair stand on end. But this woman was not a high person in society. She was in the dregs of society, but she met Jesus. And of all the things we know about Mary Magdalene, nobody was more devoted to him than she was. Once she got saved, here's a whole bunch of these men that are these apostles, and she wouldn't stop hanging around with Jesus. They might have said, you're a woman, go home. Wherever Jesus went, she was there. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But this woman, again, Jesus doesn't care who you are. He's no respecter of persons. He sees you for what you can be, what he intended you to be when he made you. And then there's two sisters by the name of Mary and Martha. And they were the sisters of Jesus' best friend, Lazarus. And you ever been to a restaurant and somebody comes up and says, "Hi, my name's Dave. I'm going to be your waiter today." When you wait on somebody, there's a lot of different ways you can wait on them. And here you got Mary and Martha. Martha's in the kitchen rattling the pots and pans, trying to make dinner for Jesus, and she opens the door in the kitchen and yells at Mary, "Get in here, I'm trying to make dinner for the Messiah." And Jesus said, "Martha, Martha, you're worried about so many things." But Martha was trying to wait on Jesus in the best way she knew how, in her own strength. But her sister Mary was waiting on Jesus, sitting at his feet, listening to every word that came out of his mouth. They were both waiting on Jesus, but they did it their own ways. And we always give Martha a bad rap when she was just doing the best she could. If you make the best rutabaga soup in the world and Jesus comes over, you want to make him your soup. You want to bless him with the best you got. And that's all she was doing. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is probably one of the most least likely women you would ever think would be mentioned in the Bible in a positive way. And it was Pontius Pilate's wife. Now, this is a Roman woman who's a pagan, but something about her. Remember, when you look at people, don't judge. Man looks on the outward, God looks on the heart. You don't know what's cooking under the skin. You don't know what's going on in their hearts and their minds. Don't judge people by the way they look. You'll miss so much of the richness of people if you just judge them by the way they look. But this woman, God saw something inside her because he gave her a dream to give to Pontius Pilate and said, "You're going to have to judge a righteous man, and whatever you do, don't have anything to do with that man. Leave him alone. Get out of it. Don't you convict him as being guilty." Now, we know Pontius Pilate did say, "Okay, crucify him," but he tried to pass off Barabbas first, and then after they said crucify him, he washed his hands to try to wash the blood. But why that's part of Scripture, I don't know, but it's part of Scripture because God is honoring this woman who's the least likely person. And the only thing I can say to that is if you would have known me 47 years ago, and you would have said, "See that guy sitting over there with vomit all over himself in the alley, and he doesn't know how to string together two words because he's so stoned and he's so scared and he can't talk to people and he's living in his car. See that guy? He's going to be a pastor of a church someday." You'd go, "I don't think so." I always joke, when Bobette was 11 years old, I was in the hospital the second time I OD'd, and they're pumping my stomach, and I'm pulling the tubes out screaming because I thought I went to hell and demons were torturing me. What if they took Bobette, that 11-year-old girl, over and they said, "See that guy on the table there? He's going to be your husband someday." She'd go, "No, please don't. What did I do wrong?" You just never know. Only God knows. Women so many times get a bad rap when it was women who were the first ones at the cross. The Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene and John, John's mother, were all the big, bad, tough apostles. Remember Peter? "Oh, yeah, I don't care. These guys are all going to leave you, but not me. I'll never leave you. I'll fight to the death." Where's Peter? He's off somewhere crying, bitterly, it says, because some woman says, "Hey, aren't you with Jesus?" And 3 times he denied even knowing him. He says, "I don't even know the blankety-blank guy. Leave me alone." Big, bad, tough Peter. But there's 3 women there. They weren't going to leave him. The first one at the tomb, who is it? Mary Magdalene. Wherever Jesus is, even in his death, I want to be where Jesus is. Who is the first one to proclaim to the big, bad, tough, powerful apostles that are going to start the church that Jesus rose from the dead? Mary Magdalene. And they said, "Get out of here, you crazy old woman. What are you talking about? He's dead." Who was the first to prophesy that the Messiah was here in the flesh? It was the prophetess Anna. at the temple when Jesus was being circumcised, and she heard him cry. At the very first prayer meeting in the day of Pentecost was the Virgin Mary, and it says other women. It doesn't name them, but there was women there. And who was the very first European convert that left outside of the Middle East? Was a woman by the name of Lydia, who was the seller of purple. And I said all that to say this. Thank God for women. Amen. Thank God for mothers. This world would be lost without you. Now, I just want to end by sharing a few quotes and poems that I've learned or heard along the way, referring to this subject of moms and the women. There's an old saying, unknown who the one that did this quote, that says, a son is a son until he takes him a wife, but your mother is your mother all of your life. And that's a good thing. I'm 69 years old, and there's nothing my mom could do for me, but I can't tell you how much I wish I could just hear her voice. Because my mother is my mother all of my life. And I got to lead her to the Lord, and I'm going to see her in heaven someday. But I miss my mom. I had 5 dads, but no matter who you are, you only got one mama. Here's a poem by an unknown woman who said, or an unknown man who said, who fed me from her gentle breasts, and hushed me in her arms to rest, and on my cheek sweet kisses pressed, my mother. This one guy said this, my mother had a great deal of trouble with me, but somehow I think she enjoyed it. That was Mark Twain said that. All I can tell you is my poor mother, when I was from my teens until I was in my early 20s, I broke that poor woman's heart 1,000 times, but she never stopped loving me. And no matter where I was, no matter what I was doing, if I was far away physically or mentally or spiritually on another planet from hallucinogenics, I always knew that there was one person in this world that loved me. It was like a light that I could go to in the darkness, and it was my mother. This guy said, my mother was the making of me. She was so true, so sure of me, and I felt that I had someone to live for and someone I must not disappoint. And that was Thomas Edison. He accomplished a few things in his life. This is my favorite one. He said, I learned more about true Christianity from my mother than all the theologians in England. And that was John Wesley, who became one of the greatest evangelists throughout all of Europe. And when John Wesley was a baby, his mother would put him to bed every night and kiss him and pray over him, and she would whisper into his ear, you're going to be a mighty man of God. God's going to use you someday to save all those around you. And guess what? Those words came true. So mamas, ladies, speak encouraging words to your children and even to your husbands, because us guys, there's no difference between men and boys except the price of our toys. Every man you ever met is just a big boy who grew up, and we don't know what in the heck we're doing. We're just trying to make it through. We need you ladies. This one is an old Jewish proverb. It says, God could not be everywhere, so he made mothers. Now, that's not theologically true because God's omnipresent and he's everywhere. But you know what that means. I used to honestly think my mother had eyes in the back of her head. They just seemed to know everything. And then, here's a mother's prayer. All the angels everywhere, her mother's love as it fills the air. Day and night I say this quiet prayer, Lord, keep my child in your care. And I'll never forget one of the times I OD'd, and they shot me up with some stuff to kind of bring me down, and they put me in this side room, and my mom thought I was asleep, but I told her later, many years later, I said, Mom, I was awake. And my mother, who wasn't a Christian at that time, literally laid her body over me and prayed, Dear God, save my son. And I told her, Mom, he did. He saved me. Here's an unknown quote. Your home is your fortress in a warring world, where a woman's hands buckles on your armor in the morning and soothes your fatigue and wounds at night. And ladies, like I said, us men, we got to be big and tough and strong and have the answers for everything. But it sure is nice to have a home to come home to. Sometimes when I work late at night, and I pull in the driveway, and I push the button, and I'm waiting for the garage door to go up. And if I look through the kitchen window and the light's on, and there's Bobette standing by the sink, and I just look and I say, Lord, you have blessed me. I have a nice home, and I got a beautiful wife that I know she loves me. I know that. And I hope she knows I love her. But what more could you ask for in life than that? And we need that. And this all comes from you ladies. I'm going to end with one last poem that I wrote for my mom. Sorry I'm talking so much about my mom, but she's the only mom I got. It's the only one I can talk about. But I wrote this to my mom when I was 20 years old, and I had it engraved on a plaque. And I was proud to say every house she ever lived in, she always took that and proudly displayed it in her living room. And when she passed away, I took that, and I got it today. But this is what I wrote to her. Sorry, I didn't know I was going to get emotional here. If I were to stand on the edge of heaven and look down upon all the earth, I could not have picked a more loving woman to be my mother. From a son to his mother, my love to you I give. From one to the other, in my heart you do live. Though we may be far apart, or may we be together, we will always be as one and live forever. And I was with my mom when she died. She was with me when I was born. What a coincidence. And I was with her when she died. And she prayed a sinner's prayer with me, and I know I'm going to see her. Amen. And my first hug when I get to heaven is going to be my Jesus hug. And after a couple thousand years, when I finally let him go, the next person I'm going to be looking for is my mama. And we're going to live forever because of what Jesus did. Ken, could you go in the back and get Bobette? Tell her we're going to be ready here in a second. I'm going to quote 2 scriptures to you, and then I'm done. In Exodus 20 and verse 12, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And this is not one of the 10 suggestions. This is a 10 commandment. I don't know who you are, and I don't know if you had a good mom or a bad mom or anything in between. But for your own sake, if your mother's still alive, do everything you can to make amends, because it will be good for you. Now, I know some moms are really hard to get along with. But you know what? Like the old saying, the older you get, the wiser your parents become. I understand now why my mom went through some of the things she did and what she said and how she responded. But with everything that's within you, have a good relationship with your mother. And if your mother's not here and she's gone on, forgive her in your heart and pray for her, because it's good for you. It's what God commands. And then I'll close with this. Proverbs 31 and verse 28. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, he praiseth her. And ladies, if you're a mother, just love your children. Love the men in your life. And I pray that they understand and they respect who you are. And if they don't, just remember this, Jesus knows. He knows.